Arab billionaire buys single mother at auction to be his surrogacy, but discovers an unexpected secret. Amara sat in a room lit only by the artificial glow of a luxurious hotel in Dubai. The air was heavy with a mixture of expensive perfumes, and the tension was almost tangible. The auction taking place was unlike anything she had ever seen or imagined. It wasn't jewelry, cars, or properties being bid on, but people, women with stories, despair, and needs. She had signed up for the program weeks earlier after receiving the devastating news that her son, Liam, needed an experimental and outrageously expensive treatment for a degenerative illness. With no family to turn to and buried in medical debt, Amara saw no other way. The promise was clear: an exorbitant amount of money in exchange for becoming a surrogate mother, under conditions dictated by the buyer. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Feeling a mix of shame and resignation, she observed the men in the room, business tycoons, magnates, all masked, shrouded in an air of mystery. When her name was announced, she hesitated for a brief moment. But thinking of Liam, she lifted her chin and walked into the hall with steady steps, ignoring the appraising gazes that examined her, as if she were an item on display. The voices echoed throughout the room as the bidding began. Amara tried not to hear the numbers, focusing instead on her breathing. Suddenly, a sharp silence overtook the space. A man sitting at the back of the hall, his golden mask glinting under the chandelier lights, raised his hand and announced a bid that left everyone in shock. No one dared to challenge it. He had won. Escorted to a private room afterward, Amara finally saw the man who now held control over her future, Khalid Al-Said. He carried himself with a regal air, his face chiseled into an expression of seriousness, his dark eyes seeming to see more than she wanted to reveal. Without ceremony, he presented the contract, stating that its terms were non-negotiable. She signed it, swallowing her pride and ignoring the weight in her chest. Khalid Al-Said was a man shrouded in mystery, every aspect of his presence reinforcing his enigmatic aura. As he reviewed the contract Amara had just signed, his expression was unreadable. He moved with calculated precision, as if every gesture had been meticulously planned. His voice was low but laced with authority, a disquieting contrast to the tense stillness of the room. He studied her without hurry, scrutinizing every detail as though she were an investment to be assessed. Amara tried to keep her focus on the paper before her, but the weight of his gaze made her swallow hard. The silence between them felt like an abyss, filled with unspoken questions neither seemed willing to voice. "I trust you understand," he finally said, breaking the silence with a tone as sharp as it was measured, "that this is not merely a transaction. What's at stake here is the continuation of a legacy." Amara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what he meant. Continuing a legacy? It felt like a cold, distant concept, given the desperate decision she had been forced to make. Yet there was something in his eyes, a blend of resolve and something deeper, perhaps pain, that made her realize Khalid was not just a man obsessed with power. He carried a burden she had yet to uncover. He stood abruptly, leaving a card with instructions on the table. "You will be taken to my estate tomorrow. From that moment on, all your needs will be met, but you will follow every rule that has been established." The final word was delivered with a firmness that sent a chill down Amara's spine. As Khalid left, she remained alone in the room, trying to process what had just happened. The weight of the contract felt heavier than she had anticipated. Something about that man didn't add up. He was powerful, yes, but what made him so guarded? And why did it seem like his decision went beyond a mere desire for an heir? The next morning, as she was driven to his estate, Amara couldn't help but notice the details of the luxury surrounding her. Everything was immaculate but cold, much like Khalid himself. Khalid's estate was enormous, surrounded by sprawling gardens of palm trees and intricately carved fountains. but there was an almost militaristic rigidity to its organization. Every detail seemed perfectly in place, leaving no room for error or spontaneity. As the gates closed behind her, Amara felt as though she was entering a different world, one that seemed impenetrable yet carried a troubling sense of confinement. Upon entering the mansion, she was led to a library where Khalid awaited her. Unlike the night before, he wasn't wearing a tie, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, though the casual attire did nothing to lessen his imposing presence. He placed a new document on the table, this one thicker and more detailed, outlining every aspect of what her life would entail in the coming months. "This is the contract that will govern your stay here," he said matter-of-factly, gesturing toward the document. "Your responsibilities, your freedoms, or the lack thereof, and the conditions you must meet." Amara's heart raced as she flipped through the pages. With each clause, it became increasingly clear that her life was no longer her own. There were rules dictating how she should eat, behave, and even when she could leave her room. Khalid watched her reactions, his face revealing no emotion, as if he were reviewing just another routine transaction. "Is there anything you'd like to discuss?" he asked, his tone almost indifferent. Amara lifted her gaze, struggling to contain the indignation threatening to boil over. "This is much more than I expected," she admitted, striving to keep her voice steady. "You knew it wouldn't be easy," he replied, and for the first time, his voice carried a slightly softer tone, almost as if a fragment of understanding flickered within it. "But if there's something that needs adjustment, speak now." She thought of her son, of her desperate need for the money, and shook her head slowly. There was no room for negotiation. Her decision had already been made. Khalid observed her for a few more seconds, then picked up a pen and extended it toward her. "Sign," he ordered, and Amara complied, feeling as if each stroke of her signature was another chain binding her freedom. Once she had signed, he carefully tucked the document into a leather folder, treating it as though it were an invaluable treasure. Then, he personally escorted her to her quarters. The room was luxurious, but no amount of luxury could mask the sense of isolation. Before leaving, Khalid looked at her with his usual serious expression. "If you follow the rules, everything will be easier. Breaking them has consequences, Amara. Severe consequences." With that, he left, leaving her alone. In the days that followed, Amara began to grasp the true weight of her new life. Every movement was monitored, every interaction timed. Khalid maintained a meticulous distance, appearing only to ensure that all conditions of the contract were being adhered to. He was as rigid as the rules he had created, but Amara noticed that, at times, he seemed to study her, as if trying to uncover something not written in the contract. Amara, however, had her own secrets. The biggest one was just a few miles away, in a hospital where her son, Liam, was waiting for the news she had promised to bring. She had told Khalid nothing about the boy, fearing it would complicate her situation even further. The contract demanded total transparency, but how could she reveal something so personal to a man who seemed incapable of empathy? One chilly morning, while walking through the gardens, Amara received a clandestine call from her friend and sole confidant, Clara. Gripping the phone tightly, Amara listened to Clara's voice, which echoed in her ears as a stark reminder of her real mission. "He's getting worse, Amara," Clara said urgently. "The doctor said he needs the treatment immediately. How much longer can you wait?" "I'm doing everything I can," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible. She glanced around, ensuring she was alone. "Please, take care of him until I get the money. I promise I won't fail." When she hung up, Amara felt the sting of tears in her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had to stay strong. She couldn't allow Khalid, or anyone else, to sense how deeply she was suffering. That evening, during dinner, Khalid observed her more closely than usual. "You seem distracted," he remarked, slicing his meal with the precision of a surgeon. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Amara froze for a moment but quickly composed herself. "No, just adjusting to this New lifestyle. He raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but didn't press further. Amara knew she couldn't maintain this facade forever, but she also didn't see another option. Her secret was her only protection and the last connection she had to the world outside those walls. Later that night, as she tried to sleep, Amara was overtaken by fragmented dreams. Liam's smile, the laughter that had once filled her life, now entwined with Khalid's piercing gaze, which always seemed to hold more knowledge than he let on. Living with Khalid was proving to be increasingly challenging. He was methodical and authoritarian, controlling even the smallest details of Amara's daily life, as if every aspect of her routine were part of some greater plan. To him, everything was a matter of order and efficiency, but to Amara, this rigidity was suffocating. She was used to improvisation, to living in uncertainty, but now she found herself trapped in a world where every step seemed preordained. One afternoon, while reading a book from the mansion's vast library, Amara was startled by Khalid's presence. He entered silently, yet his presence filled the room, sending a chill down her spine. "Are you comfortable here?" he asked, his voice as controlled as his posture. "Yes," she replied, carefully closing the book, but there was something in her tone that didn't convince him. "You say that like someone lying to avoid causing trouble," he remarked, tilting his head slightly, his eyes fixed on her. "Maybe I'm just trying to avoid unnecessary arguments," Amara responded, unable to keep a hint of sarcasm from slipping into her voice. Khalid stepped closer, and although his expression remained calm, there was an undeniable weight to his presence. "I am not a man who appreciates sarcasm, Amara. Even less so secrets." Her heart quickened, but she kept her composure. "There are no secrets, just an adjustment to an environment that isn't mine. You are my responsibility now," he said, his words cutting through the air like blades. "If there's anything that could interfere with the success of this contract, I need to know." Khalid's gaze seemed to pierce through Amara's defenses, and for a brief moment, she thought he might see right through her. But instead of cowering, she lifted her chin, a spark of defiance igniting in her eyes. "And I am fulfilling the contract," she asserted. "If I'm uncomfortable, it's not something you need to worry about as long as I'm doing my part." The tension in the room was almost tangible, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. Khalid remained silent for a moment before giving a faint smile, cold and calculated. "I admire your courage," he said, though his tone made it difficult to discern whether it was a compliment or a warning. "But remember, Amara, courage can also be dangerous." He left the library, leaving her with a mix of anger and frustration. Khalid always seemed to be in control, but Amara wasn't the type of woman to bend easily. Later, alone in her room, she reflected on the interaction. Khalid was an oppressive force, but there was something about him that also piqued her curiosity. He always seemed to be testing her, as if searching for something beyond her adherence to the contract. Amara's absences began to grow more frequent. Although the contract outlined strict schedules for her activities, she found ways to escape Khalid's controlled routine. Each time, she went to the hospital where Liam was admitted. Every visit was a cruel reminder of why she had agreed to this life. Liam was growing weaker. His eyes, once bright with childlike curiosity, were now dull, and his voice, once full of laughter, had turned hoarse and frail. Amara did her best not to cry in front of him, maintaining the smile he needed to see to hold on to hope. "Mommy, will I get better soon?" he asked, holding her hand with a grip that seemed to demand every ounce of his remaining energy. "You will, my love," Amara replied, feeling the knot in her throat tighten. "I promise. Just a little more patience." When she returned to the mansion, she carried the weight of guilt and fear. Each passing day felt like a step closer to an invisible deadline, and the pressure of hiding everything from Khalid turned her mind into a battlefield. He had already started to notice something. One morning, as Amara tried to leave discreetly, Khalid intercepted her in the hallway. He stood casually against the wall, but his eyes were sharp, like a predator watching its prey. "You've been busy lately," he remarked, his voice soft but laden with insinuations. A chill ran down Amara's spine, but she forced a smile. "I try to keep my mind occupied. I don't think idleness is very productive." Khalid tilted his head, studying her closely. "I see, but be aware that I notice more than you think." The veiled warning made Amara tense, but she managed to walk away, keeping her breathing steady. Deep down, she knew she couldn't keep her secret much longer. Later, while reviewing papers in his office, Khalid instructed one of his men to discreetly follow Amara on her next outings. He was not a man who tolerated enigmas in his life, and the woman he had hired seemed to be one entire enigma. That night, Amara dreamed of Liam again. He was running through a field of flowers, but when she tried to reach him, the ground opened beneath her feet, swallowing her into a dark abyss. She woke up with her heart racing, her face wet with tears, and a sinking certainty that time was running out. One evening, Amara was sitting in the mansion's garden, perched on a stone bench under the pale glow of the moon. The weight of her worries made the air around her feel heavier. The palm leaves swayed gently in the breeze, but the sound failed to soothe her restless mind. Then she heard footsteps. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw Khalid approaching, his hands in his pockets, his face partially obscured by shadows. "You don't strike me as someone who enjoys lonely nights," he remarked, his voice low but tinged with curiosity. Amara didn't respond immediately. She thought about standing and walking away, but something in his posture made her stay. "And you seem like someone who avoids personal interactions," she replied, with a bluntness that even surprised herself. He stepped closer but kept a respectful distance. His dark eyes met hers, and for the first time, Amara noticed something different: exhaustion, as if the weight of his meticulously crafted life was draining him. "Perhaps we're both wrong," he said, taking a seat on the opposite side of the bench. The silence between them was less oppressive than usual. Khalid's gaze shifted to the garden, his eyes lost in thought. After a while, he spoke again, this time in a softer tone. "Do you believe everything in life comes with a price, Amara?" The question caught her off guard. "I think the price varies. Sometimes it's something we're willing to pay. Other times, it forces us to sacrifice parts of ourselves we never thought we'd lose." He looked at her with an intensity that made her uneasy, yet she didn't look away. "You speak like someone who has paid dearly for something important." Amara felt her throat tighten. Images of Liam filled her mind, but she couldn't let them show. Instead, she offered a faint smile, a shield to keep her truths hidden. "And what about you, Khalid? What have you paid to be where you are now?" For a moment, he hesitated, as if weighing how much of himself he could afford to reveal. "More than people would imagine," was all he said before standing. "Good night, Amara." She stayed there, watching him disappear into the darkness. For the first time, she felt there was more to Khalid than his rigid control and obsessive need for order. Something about him resonated with her own struggles. In the days that followed, Khalid began to watch Amara more closely. She was acting strangely, frequent absences and glances that seemed to hide something. Khalid was not a man accustomed to ignoring his instincts, and something deep within him told him that Amara was guarding secrets that could change everything. One morning, as she hurried out, Khalid discreetly instructed one of his most trusted security personnel to follow her. He needed answers, but for now, he preferred to gather them without a direct confrontation. Hours later, the report he received was surprising. Amara had been seen entering a hospital, where she spent nearly 2 hours. The name of the department she visited caught his attention: pediatrics. Khalid frowned, analyzing the information with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Pediatrics? Was this a clue, or simply a coincidence? That evening, Khalid waited until Amara was having dinner in the sitting room. He entered the room silently, but his presence was quickly noticed. She looked up, immediately sensing that the energy between them had shifted. "You went to the hospital today," he said bluntly, crossing his arms and fixing his gaze on her. Amara froze. Her mind scrambled for a quick explanation, but she knew lying would be pointless. "I went to visit a friend," she said, but the hesitation in her voice betrayed the tension she felt. Khalid took a step closer, his piercing eyes locked onto hers. "Pediatrics isn't a place one visits friends, Amara. Why were you really there?" Her heart seemed to pound louder with each passing second. Her thoughts spiraled between the need to protect Liam and the impossibility of keeping what now felt inevitable a secret. "It's something personal," she replied, striving to keep her voice steady. "Personal?" Khalid repeated, the word sounding almost like an accusation. "Do you think you can hide secrets from me while living under my roof, bound by my contract?" The intensity in his voice left her breathless, but before she could respond, Khalid raised his hand, signaling her to stop. "I will find out the truth, Amara," he said with calculated coldness, but there was something more in his expression, a shadow of something she couldn't quite define. He left the room, leaving her alone, the weight of their confrontation pressing heavily on her shoulders. Amara knew the time to hide Liam's existence was running out. Khalid was a relentless man, and he wouldn't stop until he had all the answers. Later, in his office, Khalid sat with a glass of whiskey in front of him. He replayed the confrontation in his mind, a rare unease settling over him. Who was Amara, really? And what was she so desperately trying to protect? Khalid spent the entire night awake, his mind restless. As he replayed the events of the past few days, flashes of his own past surfaced, uncomfortable and unexpected. Rising from his chair, he walked to the window of his office, gazing out at the vast expanse of his property, though his thoughts were far from the present. His childhood in the desert was a stark contrast to the life of luxury he had built. He grew up in a powerful family, but one scarred by tragedy. His mother, a woman of unyielding spirit, had been his only source of warmth in a household dominated by his father's coldness. She had taught Khalid the importance of roots and legacy, but her untimely death shattered a part of him he had never been able to rebuild. He vividly remembered the last time he saw her, lying in a hospital bed, her eyes filled with tears and words left unspoken. He had been just a boy, too young to fully comprehend what he was losing, but the pain of that separation had shaped the man he would become. His relentless determination to control every aspect of his life was an unconscious attempt to avoid another devastating loss. These memories resurfaced now because, for the first time in years, Khalid felt a spark akin to what he had experienced in his mother's presence. It wasn't affection, but something far more unsettling: the vulnerability of caring. Amara, with her secrets and struggles, was slowly piercing through the walls he had so carefully built. He sat back down, running his hands over his face for a moment before picking up the report his security officer had left. The only concrete detail was that Amara spent her visits in a room within the pediatric wing. Something about it disturbed him deeply, but he couldn't yet piece it together. The next day, when he saw Amara, he decided to change his approach. Rather than confronting her, he adopted a gentler tone, though it was still loaded with intent. "You don't have to hide anything from me," he said as they walked through the mansion's corridors. "If there's something troubling you, I can help." Amara sensed the tension in his words but noticed that his tone was different this time. It wasn't just a command. There was a trace of something more human, almost as if he genuinely wanted her to trust him. "It's not something you'd understand," she replied after a moment's hesitation, keeping her eyes forward. Khalid stopped walking and turned to face her. "Don't underestimate what I understand, Amara. We all carry scars." For a moment, her eyes met his, and what she saw unsettled her. There was a depth there she hadn't expected, a weight she recognized but couldn't fully decipher. The following afternoon, Khalid made a decision that went against his principles of control and patience. He had learned to act strategically, but something about Amara and her visits to the hospital pushed him toward immediate answers. Without informing anyone, he got into his car and drove to the hospital where Amara had been seen. When he arrived, Khalid put on a simple jacket and a pair of sunglasses, attempting to blend into the environment. He walked through the cold, white corridors, feeling an unease that seemed to grow with every step. It wasn't just curiosity driving him. It was something deeper, an almost visceral need to understand what Amara was hiding. When he reached the pediatric wing, he saw Amara sitting beside a small hospital bed. The sight made him stop. She was holding the hand of a child who looked incredibly fragile, tubes connected to machines monitoring his vital signs. Amara's expression was one of pure devotion, her eyes radiating a mix of love and pain that Khalid couldn't look away from. He didn't approach immediately. Hidden in the shadow of a column, he watched. The boy opened his eyes and gave a faint smile, prompting Amara to lean forward and kiss his forehead. Khalid felt something tighten within him. The bond between them was unmistakable. There was no doubt now, this was the secret she had been keeping. After a few minutes, Khalid finally stepped forward. The sound of his footsteps made Amara lift her head, and when she saw him, the shock and fear on her face were impossible to hide. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper but heavy with panic. Khalid didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the child, who was now looking at him with curiosity. He crouched to the boy's level but maintained a respectful distance. "What's his name?" Khalid asked, his voice softer than Amara had expected. Amara hesitated but knew she could no longer avoid the truth. "Liam," she replied, her heart pounding. Khalid nodded slowly, the name echoing in his mind. He rose to his full height and turned to Amara. "Why did you hide this from me?" "Because I knew you wouldn't understand," she said, trying to hold back tears. "He's my life, and I couldn't risk you using that against me." Her words hit him like a blow, but Khalid didn't react immediately. He simply looked at her for a long moment before leaving the room without saying another word. On the drive back to the mansion, Khalid felt a storm brewing inside him. The image of Liam, so vulnerable, and the pain in Amara's eyes when confronted stirred parts of him he thought had long been dormant. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. Khalid spent the entire night replaying the scene at the hospital in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of Liam's face or the look in Amara's eyes. There was something undeniably familiar about the boy, something he couldn't ignore. Breaking his own code of conduct, Khalid ordered a detailed investigation into Amara's past. The next morning, the answers arrived faster than Khalid had anticipated. The documents he received left no room for doubt. Liam was his biological son. The revelation left him stunned. The connection was undeniable, confirmed by a DNA test he had discreetly ordered using a sample collected at the hospital. Khalid stared at the report for long minutes, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions he didn't know how to process. When he found Amara in the mansion's sitting room, she was visibly nervous, clearly bracing for the confrontation. He entered with the document in hand, his face a mask of tension. "Why didn't you tell me?" he began, his voice heavy with an emotion Amara couldn't decipher. She hesitated, knowing there was no longer any way to avoid the truth. "Because I knew it would change everything. And I didn't know what you would do." Khalid stepped closer, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her take a small step back. "Do you think I would have ignored this? That I wouldn't have taken responsibility?" "I didn't know," Amara replied, her voice trembling. "You're a man who lives for control, Khalid. I was afraid that, if you found out about Liam, you'd see him as just another piece of your legacy, not as the sweet, fragile boy he is." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Khalid knew she was right. He had always treated his life as an equation, where control and logic were the most important variables. But Liam wasn't an equation. He was his son. I should have figured it out sooner, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Amara saw the change in his expression. A man accustomed to having all the answers, now confronted with a truth that left him reeling. Khalid, she said softly, trying to break the silence. I did what I did because it was the only way to ensure Liam got the treatment he needed. I didn't do it to deceive you. He nodded but didn't respond immediately. After a moment, he turned to her, his gaze still intense. I want to meet him, he said simply, but his words carried a heavy weight. And I want to be part of his life. Amara felt tears sting her eyes, but she said nothing. She only nodded, knowing she could no longer shield Liam from a part of himself that now also belonged to Khalid. Khalid's decision to meet Liam marked the beginning of a transformation in his dynamic with Amara. The two traveled together to the hospital the following morning, the tension between them growing heavier with every passing mile. Amara sat restlessly, her fingers intertwined in nervousness, while Khalid kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his face a mask of restraint. When they arrived at Liam's hospital room, the boy was awake, his eyes weary but still curious. Amara entered first, offering him a gentle smile as she took his hand. Khalid lingered in the doorway for a moment, as if the gravity of the moment was holding him back from taking the next step. Liam, Amara said softly, kneeling beside the bed. There's someone here who would like to meet you. Khalid's eyes met Liam's for the first time, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He stepped forward, his breath slow and measured, while the boy watched him with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Hello, Liam, Khalid said, his voice softer than Amara had ever heard. My name is Khalid. Liam blinked a few times before smiling, a small but meaningful gesture. Are you my mom's friend? Khalid paused, the words catching in his throat. Something like that, he replied, uncertain of how to explain that he was much more than that. Amara watched the interaction with a tight chest. The distance between the two was almost palpable, but there was also a connection, something fragile yet undeniable, beginning to take shape. After a few moments, Khalid sat beside the bed and began speaking with Liam, asking simple questions about what he liked to do and how he was feeling. The boy answered with the unfiltered honesty typical of a child, and Khalid, to Amara's surprise, seemed genuinely interested. Later, as they stood alone in the hallway, Khalid turned to Amara, his expression laden with emotion. He's extraordinary, he said, his voice breaking under the weight of the moment. He is, Amara replied, her eyes shimmering with tears. Khalid ran a hand over his face, as if trying to process it all. I should have been here from the beginning, he murmured, more to himself than to her. You didn't know, Amara said gently, and I did everything I could to make sure you didn't. But you're here now, Khalid, and that's what matters. The look Khalid gave her was filled with gratitude and guilt. For the first time, he appeared vulnerable, a man confronted not only with the truth but with the possibility of redemption. The drive back to the mansion after meeting Liam was silent but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Khalid barely said a word during the journey, lost in a storm of emotions. In the boy, he saw not just a genetic connection but the chance for something he hadn't even realized he wanted. A true bond. A few days later, a call from Clara, Amara's friend, shattered the fragile sense of normalcy that had begun to form. Liam's condition had worsened. Amara received the news in the middle of the night and rushed to the hospital in a panic. Khalid, seeing her leave in such haste, insisted on going with her. At the hospital, the tension was suffocating. The doctors explained that the experimental treatment needed to begin immediately, or Liam wouldn't survive. Amara listened to every word as if they were knives piercing her heart, while Khalid stood beside her, his face stoic but his eyes betraying the worry he couldn't suppress. How much time do we have? Khalid asked the doctor, his voice steady. Only a few days, came the reply. Khalid turned to Amara, gripping her shoulders firmly. He will get the treatment, Amara, no matter the cost. She nodded, but deep down, She knew that money wasn't the only problem. The treatment required a compatible donor for a specific transfusion, and finding one in such a short time seemed almost impossible. The situation felt hopeless, but Khalid took charge. He ordered immediate testing for himself, Amara, and even distant relatives he still had contact with. His determination was unrelenting, and for the first time, Amara saw what he was capable of when it came to protecting someone he loved. While they waited for the results, Amara stayed by Liam's side, holding his small hand, while Khalid watched from a distance, his heart heavy. He had never felt so powerless. The boy was fighting for his life, and for the first time in years, Khalid found himself praying, pleading with a higher power to give him the chance to make things right and be the father Liam needed. By the end of the day, the results came in. Khalid was a match. When the doctor confirmed the news, Khalid barely hesitated. "Do whatever is necessary," he said, his voice resolute. Khalid's decision brought immediate relief to Amara, but it also revealed something deeper. He wasn't the cold, unfeeling man he had always tried to appear. Beneath his rigid facade lay a heart capable of genuine sacrifice. The preparation for Liam's treatment began swiftly. Khalid stood by Amara's side as the doctors explained the next steps. The transfusion was only part of the process. The remainder required advanced resources and rapid decisions. Even with Khalid willing to cover all expenses, the procedure still carried significant risks. Amara spent the night beside Liam, gently stroking his fine hair as he slept. His fragility was painfully evident, making her heart ache even more. When Khalid entered the room, he found her silently crying. He didn't say a word. He simply approached her and placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture laden with meaning. The next morning, Amara asked Khalid to speak with her in private. They sat in the hospital's waiting room, away from the doctors and nurses. "Khalid, I've been thinking a lot," she began, her voice low but steady. "If the treatment isn't enough, there's another option. I can be the bone marrow donor." He looked at her, surprise evident in his eyes. "Do you understand what that means, Amara? It's not a simple procedure. Could be dangerous for you." "I know," she replied, meeting his gaze, "but I would do anything for Liam. He's my son. He's everything I have." Khalid felt a tightening in his chest at her words. He knew Amara was willing to sacrifice everything for Liam, but the idea of her putting herself at risk unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. "What if it's not necessary?" he asked, trying to rationalize. "But what if it is?" Amara countered. "I won't stand by while there's something I can do to save him." Her unwavering determination left him momentarily speechless. For the first time, Khalid saw Amara not just as a resilient woman, but as someone capable of facing anything for love. It both terrified and inspired him. When the doctors confirmed that the initial treatment was working but acknowledged that a future transplant might still be necessary, Amara reaffirmed her decision to be the donor if needed. Khalid, on the other hand, resolved to do everything in his power to ensure that neither Amara nor Liam would have to face further danger. What had once been a matter of responsibility now became something deeply personal and non-negotiable. As the weeks passed, Liam's treatment began to show positive results. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but the relief that enveloped Amara and Khalid was palpable. Liam gradually regained his strength, and the smile Amara loved so much finally returned to his face. During this time, Khalid began visiting the hospital regularly. He engaged in conversations with Liam, asking questions, sharing stories about the desert, and bringing small gifts that made the boy laugh. For Amara, watching them together was both a relief and a source of conflicting emotions. She feared what this new dynamic might mean, but also saw that Khalid was genuinely connecting with Liam in a way she hadn't anticipated. One day, during one of these visits, while Liam was sleeping, Amara and Khalid went to the hospital's modest cafeteria for coffee. The setting was simple, but the moment felt deeply significant. "You've changed," Amara said, breaking the silence. Khalid looked up at her, his expression calm. Maybe you've changed too. Or perhaps we're just seeing each other differently." Amara smiled, but there was an underlying sadness in her eyes. "I know that for you, everything has always been about control. But Liam, he's not something you can plan or command. He's human, Khalid. Fragile and full of emotions." "I know," Khalid replied, his voice quieter. "And I've realized that control means nothing if there's nothing real to protect. I didn't understand that until now." The two fell into silence again, but it was a comforting silence, unlike any they had shared before. Khalid reached across the table and took Amara's hand. The gesture was unexpected, but she didn't pull away. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "But I want you to know that I'm not doing this out of obligation. I'm here because I want to be here." Amara felt a wave of emotion rise within her, nearly bringing her to tears. For the first time, she saw Khalid as a man, not just the cold billionaire who had bought her contract. He was learning to love imperfectly but sincerely. "Thank you," she said, gently squeezing his hand. That night, when she returned to Liam's room, Amara felt more hopeful than she had in months. There was something about her connection with Khalid that seemed to be growing stronger, not just for Liam's sake, but for their own. Months passed, and Liam was finally discharged from the hospital. He still needed care and medical follow-ups, but his recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Everyone celebrated the milestone. Amara decided it was time to leave the nightmares of the past behind and start a new life with her son. However, Khalid's presence had become an inescapable part of their lives. That evening, at the mansion, Khalid hosted a dinner to celebrate Liam's recovery. The boy was radiant, playing with a small toy car Khalid had given him. Amara watched them with a smile on her lips, but her heart was conflicted. After Liam went to bed, Amara and Khalid were left alone on the terrace. The night was clear, the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. Khalid poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to her. "You did it, Amara," he said, gazing out at the horizon. "You saved Liam. I was just a small part of it all." "You were much more than just a part," Amara replied, turning to face him. "Without you, I never could have done this. But I still don't know how this works. We come from such different worlds, Khalid." He looked at her, his eyes glinting under the starlight. "I know there are differences, Amara, and I know you're strong enough to do all of this on your own. But I don't want you to have to. I want to be by your side because I choose to be, not because it's my duty." A single tear rolled down Amara's cheek, but it was one of relief, not sadness. For the first time, she believed his words. Khalid was no longer the rigid man who had bought her freedom at an auction. He was someone who had learned to care, to be vulnerable, and who was now willing to fight for their future. "And what happens now?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Now," he said, taking her hand, "we figure it out together." In the months that followed, Khalid proved his dedication not just to Liam, but also to Amara. He adjusted his life to include them both, letting go of his obsession with absolute control and allowing himself to live in the present. Amara, in turn, made space for Khalid in her heart, not without challenges, but with the certainty that he had earned his place in their lives. One day, as they strolled through the garden with Liam running ahead, Khalid knelt among the flowers and took Amara's hand. "I know our beginning wasn't conventional," he began, looking at her with the sincerity he had learned to show. "But what matters isn't how we started. It's what we're building now. Amara, will you build this future with me?" Amara looked at him, feeling love and gratitude wash over her. She nodded with a smile, and Khalid, for the first time in his life, felt that he had everything he had ever wanted: a family. If you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe. A big hug, and see you in the next video.